The next step is the epoxy step. First of all, the backing material, this is black novaculite, is perfectly dry. It's flattened with a 300 mesh or grit flat lap, and the same goes with the back of this piece of opal, which by the way weighs a little over 4 carats. I must have misweighed it before. I thought it was 3. People have taken thin pieces of opal like this and painted the back black, and you get the same effect as having a doublet, only you don't have the strength. The next step is the epoxy. This is the epoxy that I used. I started using this material. I must have read a book or watched a video. It wasn't a YouTube video, but I think that was a little before YouTube, but this is the epoxy that I use. I don't know that this epoxy is any better than what you buy in the store. This is Elmer's. I use this quite a bit for lots of things, and I've never had a problem with it. These are applicator sticks, about 2.5 millimeters in diameter or something like that. You can buy a box of 1,000 for probably $5 to $10. As hardener. So that's how much I have. I'm going to put it down right there. This is way too much epoxy. I shouldn't have stuck it that deep in, but that's the resin. When working with jars of epoxy, it's best to keep them closed because just the fumes of the hardener can start the hardening process. You can see my hardener. It always hardens a little on the surface, but I'm going to try to get the same amount of hardener as I have epoxy. That looks about right. And I'm going to put it right here next to the resin. Now, at this point, in the past, many times I use a blackening dye to blacken the epoxy itself. This is a powdered epoxy dye. I'm not familiar with this type. I've used the liquid in the past. The stone itself is very black, and the opal is very thin. I'm going to skip this step. Ordinarily, I would put a dot of liquid dye, black dye, into the epoxy before I mix it, but I'm not going to do that here. Well, the next step is to take another applicator stick and mix it up. So I think it's fairly well mixed up at this point. It often helps to heat the backing material. I'm not doing that here. I'm just going to put it on. It doesn't really, you need a relatively thick coat. And the only reason you need, just to be sure that the entire back is covered. Now that the back is covered, I take the opal flat back and just put it straight onto, and I'm going to push on it and wiggle it around. So that little area on the back that's a little crack, everything gets filled with epoxy. It's okay to have a little, got some epoxy on my finger. That's not as desirable as I'd like, but if we move that around, you can see, let's see if I can get a close-up of this. you can see that most areas have a wall of epoxy built up at the edge, and that it will grind off later. This is the doublet after it's dried, and I've also trimmed a few pieces off the edge with the trim saw. Although this is supposed to be 5-minute epoxy, you really have to give it longer than that. As a rule, I generally give it, if I do it in the morning, I'll by early evening, 7 o'clock maybe, it will be dry enough. You'll note that it doesn't look quite as shiny as it did yesterday, and that's because there is a very thin layer of epoxy from my touching it with my soiled with epoxy gloves yesterday. But I'm going to go grind it down approximately to these dimensions. I've ground most of the excess backing off of this. For those of you who think that I'm crazy for taking a 4-carat opal, solid crystal opal, and turning it into a doublet, I just say this: making a doublet is reversible. If I want, at any time, I can grind this back completely off of it, basically right down to the opal, and lose very little carat weight from the solid opal. So I can just take this back to a solid opal just by grinding it on the flat lap. I've thinned the back of the material, the backing material, which is black Novaculite from Arkansas in the USA. And I've polished the surface to 14,000 mesh. I normally finish my polish with cerium oxide, and I will once this is in its final form. But that's the steps for making an opal doublet. There's no doubt that this looks like high-grade black opal, and it would even look more black if I chose to thin the opal itself more than it is now. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you later.